About to leave, already packed me. I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out, die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go, let's be free with me. Be free. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out, die with my own doubts. Be free. Let's go, let's be free.
Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the latest in our series of revision blasts. We're heading for exams, mocks, and things in the spring and the summer, and hopefully this next 30 minutes or so will be a useful way to add application to your revision notes, test your understanding, build awareness, and generally support the progress as you head towards these important papers. Thanks for joining in. Those of you in the live stream, as always, we encourage people to make their contributions in chat, and we'll give a shout out to some great answers. Just in this week, we've had some amazing sessions, some superb students adding great value to the sessions. So today we're going to focus on international competitiveness, supply-side policies, and maybe spend 5 minutes or so thinking about the initial consequences, for good or ill, of the Brexit departure from the EU. Before we start, though, a quick reminder that we are heading across the country at the end of March into April on our live revision events. Super excited to be going to places like Bristol, Birmingham, Leeds, London, Manchester, Portsmouth to host live events. We do an intensive day of revision, exam board specific. I'm doing the week in London, for example, right at the end of March. I'm very excited about that. And if you get a subscription to that event, you also get a subscription to our live online offer on-demand course, which is a stunning grade booster revision course online. So I hope to see some of you there. Okay, so let's look at competitiveness, supply-side policies, and Brexit. I've got 4 bubble quiz questions for you. Here we go. Now, I'll post a question here, and the number of answers can be that are correct can be 1, 2, 3, 4, or none of them. Post the answers in chat, and we'll give a shout out to people as they do. Which of these countries are in the top 10 in the world for research and development spending, measured this time as a share of their GDP. So not measured in dollars or pounds. Which of these countries are in the top 10 in the world for the highest research and development spending as a share of GDP? What do we think? 4 countries: Israel, South Korea, Germany, and China. Zach thinks it's A, B, C, and D. He's trying to read my mind, I think. Het thinks it's A and B. Luke thinks it's B and C. Clyde thinks it's B, C, and D. And Casper thinks it's A, B, and C. A lot of people seem to think that B is definitely in there. Okay, Theo thinks it's B, C, D. Let's have a look at the answers. And hats off to you if you said A, B, and C. I think Casper got that. So did Mungo, and so did Will Townsend. So congratulations. Israel is top. I think something like 5% of their GDP is R&D. South Korea about 4.5%. Germany about 3.5%. By the way, that's twice what it is in the UK. If you're writing notes, by the way, during the session, the UK is 1.7%. The government has a target to lift that to 2%. Israel way out ahead. Here's our second question. Which of these countries in 2021 ran a current account surplus on their balance of payments of more than 10% of their GDP? Our 4 countries are Chile, South Korea, Singapore, and Ireland. So current account, of course, is the trade balance plus net primary and secondary incomes, often taken as a guide to competitiveness. Not perfect, but it's a measure. What do we think? Paddy thinks A and D, Chile and Ireland. Sean thinks D, and Tom thinks A and B. Devanshi thinks it's just D, and Bella thinks it's B and C. Joe thinks it's A, C, and D. Okay, what do we think here? Well, I've got people gone for A, C, and D. The answer is coming up. It's C and D. Now, all of these countries, they run significant current account surpluses. So they're good examples of countries to have in your revision notes of countries that are competitive in terms of their trade performance. Singapore and Ireland have huge current account surpluses. A lot of that, of course, is Ireland's used as a base for exporting products, including financial services. Singapore has a trade to GDP ratio of over 370%. It's a hub country. All of them have current account surpluses, but Singapore and Ireland have huge surpluses, in part because they're relatively small countries. So a big trade surplus is going to be a significant percentage of GDP, isn't it? Here's our third bubble quiz question. Just to get us going today, which of these countries is ranked in the world's top 10 for high-tech exports? So this measures high knowledge, high-tech exports as a share of, as a percentage of their manufactured exports. The Philippines, Malaysia, Japan, and China. Which of these countries is ranked in the world's top 10 for having high-tech exports, which are a big percentage of their manufactured exports? So just putting together a kettle or a toaster is not a high-tech export. But if you have an export which has a lot of knowledge and technology and software and coding into it, that becomes a high-tech sector. What do we think? Zach has gone for A, B, and C. Georgia thinks A and C. Ishrat goes for A, B, and C. Will Townsend, C and D. Yeah, Cheetah Jim, my producer's saying a high-tech kettle, presumably one with Wi-Fi and an IP address in it. Theo thinks C and D. Interestingly, on China here, what do we think? Is D going to be the right answer here? Is China one of the world's big high-tech exporters in manufacturing? Bavika thinks A and B, and Gami is confident on A. Let's have a look at the answer. And the answers are A, B, and D. Yes, China does make the world's top 10 countries now for high-tech exports. Interestingly, the Philippines and Malaysia do as well. Those of you studying development economics, those 2 countries are making significant progress in their scaled competitiveness in terms of high-tech manufacturing exports. They've moved from being beyond just an assembly economy. And critically, those of you taking notes again, this is a key factor when you're trying to escape the so-called middle income trap. You know, you get your per capita income to a certain level, countries find it hard to lift it to the next tranche, the next level. Philippines and Malaysia look in reasonably good shape to do that. Japan, interestingly, is not actually in the top 10, in part because they've had 2 decades of deflation, and a lot of Japanese companies have left Japan. They've invested in other countries to produce their high-tech products because they're no longer counted as a Japanese export, which is quite interesting. Here's my last bubble quiz question. These are some good answers, by the way. Let's talk about mobile telephony. Which of these countries have more than 100 mobile phone subscribers per 100 people? In other words, there are more mobile phones than people in these countries, suggesting that some people have more than one mobile phone, maybe for business and household use. Brazil, Hong Kong, India, Thailand. What do we think? Bavika thinks A, B, C, and D. Zach has gone for C and D. Joseph thinks C and D. And one of our regulars, the Riddler, always comes to our revision sessions. A, B, C, and D. Abbas thinks it's B. Casper thinks it's B. A lot of people saying A, B, C, and D. Birdie's saying, is it a trick question? No, it's not a trick question. Let's have a look at the answer. The answer is B and D. Hong Kong, one of the most connected city-states in the planet. Thailand, 177 mobile phones per 100 people. So on average, people in Thailand have nearly 2 mobile phones each. Brazil and India, about 85, 90, not quite 100, but obviously that's growing over time. It's a sign of connectivity. Well done. If you got any of those right, that is superb. It's just good application. Let's crack on. So what we'll try and cover just briefly in the time we have together is how do we measure price and cost competitiveness. There's a really key measure I just want to walk you through, something you all have to know. I'll say a little bit about micro and macro supply side policies, because the examiners have been really quite clear in their reports about what they're expecting to see. And we'll say a little bit about Brexit and some of the consequences of that. And there's going to be an opportunity for you to contribute in the live chat as well. Okay, so our key measure. If you get a question on competitiveness, and it does appear a lot on exam papers, the main measure of a country's competitiveness is something called relative unit labour costs, RLUC for short, relative unit labour costs. What that measures basically is the cost of making, the labour cost of making something, like a toaster or a car or LCD screen, or whatever it is, or a smartphone, per unit produced. Now, there are 2 factors that determine unit labour costs. First of all, hourly labour costs. What are the wages? What are the salaries in a particular industry in a particular country? Secondly, productivity, efficiency, output per worker employed or output per hour worked. So unit labour costs are driven by labour wages and by productivity. So if wages rise by more than productivity, the unit cost will go up. But relative is really key. That means we have to convert into a common currency like a dollar or a euro. And therefore, if a country's currency goes down in value, if it depreciates, then a country's relative unit labour costs will fall. And in theory, this makes them more competitive in price and cost terms. So if you get a question on competitiveness, if you're taking revision notes today, this is a really, really key measure. If you're watching on replay, just maybe take a screenshot or press the pause button. Relative unit labour costs are a key measure, often tested by the exam board. Let me give you some examples of this. I've taken 10 European countries. There were 27 European Union countries. There's one country that left a couple of years back. I can't remember which one it was. These are the hourly labour costs in 2021. Now, take a look at the chart. Bulgaria has an hourly labour cost of €7. Denmark, 7 times that, almost 47 euros per hour. So clearly, Bulgaria and Croatia and countries like Poland and Greece and Spain have much lower labour costs than countries like Germany, Netherlands, and Denmark. But does that necessarily mean that Bulgaria has the lowest relative unit labour costs? The answer is not necessarily. I mean, it should have low costs, but as the next slide shows, it depends. It depends critically on productivity. So you might be given this chart in an exam, but you haven't been given the productivity stats. We don't know how productive a worker is in Sofia, in Bulgaria, compared with, I don't know, Amsterdam in Holland. Okay, so it could be the case that Dutch productivity is much higher than Bulgaria and Croatia, which would bring the difference down. And critical, of course, the exchange rate also matters. So it could be the case that Croatia has a weak exchange rate against the euro. That brings down their relative hourly labour costs. But it does suggest, by the way, that countries like Slovenia, Slovakia, Poland should be attractive to inward investment inside the European Union because they have relatively low hourly labour costs. Now, moving on. So that's your key measure, unit labour costs. And countries with low relative unit labour costs are often considered as competitive, particularly when it comes for multinationals, TNCs, deciding where to locate their manufacturing or their operations. But of course, it's not the only factor driving competitiveness. So you have to think about non-wage factors, corporation tax, other incentives, environmental taxes, industry regulations, the cost of hiring and firing labour, and then critically things like infrastructure, such as transport, telecoms, and energy. Can you get the skilled labour you need? How easy is it to do business? How strong are the institutions, the legal institutions? And the wider issue about macro stability. Do countries have low inflation? Do they have stable interest rates? All those kind of things. So the point from this slide is that unit labour costs are your starting point, but then you have to factor in a load of other measures, load of other indicators to talk about competitiveness in general terms. Now, often you'll get an exam question saying, assess policies that might be used to improve competitiveness. And there's obvious ones: devalue the exchange rate, reduce taxes, etc. But keep in mind that competitiveness is a much more complex concept than just one factor. What I want to look at in this next section is thinking about supply side policies. And before I do, by the way, quick update on the UK. So the UK is sliding down the competitiveness rankings. The World Economic Forum back in November published their latest figures, just taking Europe and the Middle East and some North African countries. The UK's peer group ranking is now 23rd. It was 18th the year before. We ranked 39th on international trade out of 63 countries, 61st on inflation, obvious reason why. On labour market, 35th, education 21st, and infrastructure 19th. So we're nowhere near the top 10 competitiveness countries in terms of the European Union, Middle East, and North Africa. Which raises the interesting question, an important question: what kind of supply side policies could be used to try and improve our competitiveness? If you bear with me, I just want to take you through, and as the next slide shows, this really key point. It's highly likely you'll get an exam question on supply side policies to do competitiveness, the trade balance, growth, unemployment, cutting inflation, what have you. All students will revise supply side policies in the next few weeks. The exam boards are being really clear. They don't like generic answers. So if you say, for example, the UK government could increase spending on education and training, it's not wrong, but it's not a good answer. You have to be more specific, more detailed, more granular in your approach. And hopefully this next 5 minutes will be useful revision for you in terms of giving you that extra detail. The more specific you can be when it comes to supply side policies, the stronger your analysis will be, and therefore that opens the door to better evaluation. So if you bear with me in our time together, can we just spend 2 or 3 minutes thinking about micro and macro supply side policies? So here we go. And you'll see what I've done here. I have put in the famous words which are tutored to you. We give a lot of store by, such as. Please let me emphasize this again. The more times you can use such as in your exam answers this summer, any exam answer, including the mocks, the more credit you will get, because you're going to get application. Most supply side policies are micro policies. So deregulation, liberalization, opening up markets such as energy supply, banking, challenger banks, and insurance. That's an attempt to increase the supply side capacity in those sectors. Privatization is favored by some people as a supply side policy, such as the Royal Mail. On the labour market side, work visas for occupations such as vets, data scientists, people working as senior care professionals, etc. That is a supply side policy to try and increase labour supply in specific sectors. Carbon pricing, waste and recycling rules, industry regulations there can often drive innovation. Fiscal supply side policies, such as early childcare subsidies, reforms to rented housing, and critically, maybe the government offering specific tax incentives to encourage investment in industries such as life sciences. So what's the point I'm making here? If you get a question on supply side policies, please put in the phrase such as, because, and then give something very specific, because it's going to give you more detail, more context, and you'll get the application marks. If you're just talking very general terms like education, training, you won't get the credit. On the macro side, next slide shows just a few examples of macro supply side policies. So whole economy changes in income tax and corporation tax. We'll look at migration policies in a minute in terms of Brexit, big trade agreements, major infrastructure projects, general government spending on education and healthcare, increased funding per se across the education sector, and policies designed to make the entire labour market more flexible, more mobile. Those are kind of macro policies. I haven't put such as in this section because we're going to go through that now and invite some answers from you. So the point I want to take away from this is please be specific in the policies you make. If you put in a generic answer, you'll get level 2 analysis and application, which is no good. You need to be much higher than that. Okay, so let's think about these policies. Can you give me, this is why we invite answers in chat. We'll give a shout out to people as they post the answers in. Can you give me some recent examples, please, of UK supply side policies that are designed to increase investment as a share of our GDP? 30 seconds. What can you come up with? Over to you. Okay, not easy to think of policies in 30 seconds and write them down. I might give you half a minute next time. I'm feeling particularly generous today. So Gabby talked about subsidies for car manufacturers to produce electric vehicles in the UK. Love that example, Gabby. I'm going to add that to my own notes, in fact. Clyde talks about HS2. Tom talks about the apprenticeship scheme. Interesting. That would be, it's not hard investment. That's a really good example of investment in soft skills. Really good answer. Okay, the Riddler talks about increasing the time in education to 18 years, raising the school leaving age. Really interesting. Our focus here is capital investment. Capital investment. So here's my suggestions. By the way, some great examples there. Those of you live will be following the chat window. The quality of answers is just unbelievable. Maybe you can add to your notes here. So I would argue that the super deduction is a really interesting policy. So super deduction is a tax relief. I think it's 125, 130%, whereby, for example, if you are making an investment, let's say Tutor2 spending £10,000, giving contributors new chairs, new computers, and new screens. That super deduction means they can offset £13,000 against their corporation tax liability. So basically, it reduces how much corporation tax they have to pay. So super deduction is really designed to get small businesses to retool their factories or to invest in new software and hardware. It has proved to be quite effective in terms of lifting small business investment. Another really good one is the free ports. 12 free ports, 8 in England, 3 in Scotland, 1 in Wales. And also the major infrastructure projects, which we'll talk about in a second, plus the new infrastructure bank or the British Business Bank. So those are 3 policies. Superb on that. Chitty Chews was saying we've spent 25,000 this year on capital spending to get the benefit from super deduction. I don't think any of that came my way, but I'll ask that after the session. Next question. Here we go. So that was good. Can you give me, please? This is Chitty Chew community. What can you give me? Specific examples, please, of current infrastructure projects in the UK. Always worth adding to your notes. Half a minute this time. Here we go. Yeah, of course, some of these projects could be private sector projects. I should have made it a bit more specific in terms of maybe government or public-private partnerships. Dark cyber sabers, offshore hydroelectric wind farms, HS2 nuclear power. If I had $1 for every time somebody mentioned HS2 there, that I would be able to retire straight away and finish the session early. Some great answers there. I love the point about smart motorways, Heathrow expansion plans. Crossrail 2, of course, which would be north-south, King's Cross regeneration, and so on. The people who give good answers to this are nearly always superb geographers. I've got a feeling we've got some superb geographers with us today. Here are my 3 examples. Again, it's just worth having in your notes a couple of good examples for application, isn't it? So high-speed rail, HS2. Probably going to finish or start a little shed just north of London. The Thames Tideway Tunnel is a big project, the London Super Sewer, which is much needed. And quite a few people mentioned the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station. Smart motorways. Our infrastructure isn't great, if truth be told. And oftentimes we need smaller infrastructure projects, such as the Scottish government's invested £45 million in building some new railway stations, for example, including one that serves Inverness Airport. But I won't say much more than that because people will then complain I'm just a railway geek, which I'm not. Let's move on then. Okay, so how about this is harder. Okay, so thinking about Brexit as a little segue, can you throw into the chat window some examples of pro-competitiveness policies introduced in the UK since Brexit in 2020? This is hard. Let's see who's got some great knowledge and application here. Over to you. Abbas is bang on it. That one, free trade deal with New Zealand, getting rid of the cap, I think, on bankers' bonuses. Digital markets. Evie talks about free ports there. Will Townsend talks about removing EU regulations, some of which have happened, some of which haven't happened yet. Will Jones, the Anglo-Indian Free Trade Agreement and the new DMS competition regime. Yeah, okay, so this is happening. This is kind of it's a work in progress, clearly. We left the EU 3 years ago, essentially. Paddy talks about the implementation of maths being required. That's not really it could be seen as a post-Brexit policy, this obsession with STEM, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that the UK has been able to do since we left. Head talks about pork markets, a little quirky reference there to one of our shortest serving prime ministers. What have I gone for? I've gone for 3 things which I think are really quite significant. One is that UK government, of course, replaced free movement, and this is significant because you might get a question on migration. They've replaced the free movement, which is a common feature of a single market, a stage 4 of economic integration, with a points-based immigration system. And in particular, the UK government's brought in things like English language requirement, minimum salaries, but visas for skilled workers. As we'll see in a few minutes, something like 300,000 visas have now been issued for skilled workers. And the list of industries that's part of this scheme is going up and up and up as the issue becomes more prevalent. It's not just lorry drivers, it's lots of different occupations. So I think that would be a major one if you're taking notes today. Add in that points-based immigration system. But please don't necessarily use the words Australian style because that doesn't give it any more credibility. The government's just introduced some recent reforms to farming, in particular paying farmers for environmental protection and husbandry. The 12 free ports plus the $5 billion levelling up fund. It's all part of kind of regional policy. And they have agreed trade deals with 70 countries, plus one more. They've got a trade agreement with the EU, although most of those trade deals actually are just replications of existing trade deals. So there's quite a bit happening. So again, as you go into the exam, have a little bit of knowledge. You don't need a lot, but if you can put it in your answers, you will rise up the mark schemes pretty quickly. Next one again is on Brexit. Here's the next challenge for you. Thinking about Brexit in our little final section here, can you give me 3 drawbacks to growth and competitiveness from Brexit? What can you come up with? Over to you. Okay, Munger talks about the loss of free movement. Milan talks about transactions costs. We'll certainly mention that in a second. Paddy talks about a decrease in skilled foreign workers. Sean talks about an increase in tariffs and red tape. And again, Abbas, who's on fire today, making some superb points about non-tariff barriers, and from incompatible regulation and the loss of the Cambridge Research Fund. To which I would add, by the way, Abbas, the ending of the the fact that the UK is no longer part of the Erasmus program for students. Osama bin Laden talks about farm subsidy disappearing. This suggests to me, 30 seconds suggests to me that we have a group of students here who are absolutely bang on this. This is a hugely important topic. It's obviously controversial, but the more economics we can talk about, the better. Here are my points, just in case you want to add to your revision notes. My strong advice is to be aware of the difference between tariff and non-tariff barriers. So the UK has a trade agreement with the EU, a free trade agreement, including a Northern Ireland protocol. More on that next week, I think. But a significant number of non-tariff barriers. If you need to export to the EU now, you must meet their standards. Even though the UK is not part of the European Union anymore, those standards, those non-tariff barriers, those regulations remain in place. That has added significantly to cost, particularly, as we'll see in a few minutes, for small and medium-sized enterprises, many of whom used to export to the EU. Now, some of whom are now basing themselves in the EU, warehouses there and things to trade within the market. Go back to 2021, big issues were labour shortages, firms struggling to hire workers, big issues to do with product scarcity and so on and so forth. So the free movement has ended. Migration from the EU has come down, although we'll see in a second that the picture is changing. And also, another negative effect is probably that growth has slowed down in the UK. The government's increasing its spending, obviously a lot linked to the pandemic. So one of the impacts on growth has been the government's growth has slowed down. The government's having to borrow more. Taxes have gone up, including a big jump in corporation tax. Just thinking about this more widely, the next slide I think is quite important. When we left the EU, the pound depreciated quite sharply. This chart shows the pound against the euro, and it had been rising actually after the global financial crisis. It reached about €1.40, but you can see that it fell quite sharply from about 1.30 to about 1.10, 1.15. So there was a fall in the pound after the Brexit referendum, which was essentially the markets casting a judgment on what they thought was going to happen to the UK. But that did make the UK more competitive in price terms in the first few years after the referendum, and I think that helped to sustain growth in the UK. But other things are not quite as good. Let's look at the migration data. This chart shows net migration. So the green line is people coming into the UK. The orange line is people leaving the UK. And the bar chart is just the difference between the green and the orange line. It's net migration. And you can see that after the referendum, there was a fall in net migration. Started picking up again in 2020, but then you see the impact of the pandemic. So it was a sharp fall in net migration. But since then, and the UK economy is coming out, obviously, of the pandemic, there's been a significant rise in net migration. It's now above 500,000. Now, partly that's tens of thousands of students coming back to the UK from China, from Hong Kong, from all around the world as travel restrictions have been lifted. But what you're also seeing is a substantial rise in work visas given to people from all around the world, including non-EU countries. So the UK government, I think, has had to respond to labour shortages by relaxing the labour migration policies. And in a way, This is, the exam was written over a year ago, but this is now changing. The labour migration is going up into the UK post-Brexit. A lot of people thought it would fall. Another chart I wanted to show you was this one, which shows business investment. Now, a lot of people feared that investment would stall in the wake of the Brexit referendum and the fallout from that. There is some evidence that has happened. So this chart shows real investment. The actual is the blue line. The trend line is what would have happened had the average from 2009, 2016 continued. So investment has stalled in the UK. Some of that is Brexit related. A lot of it is probably pandemic related. Companies just didn't have the cash or the confidence to invest. But I think one of the points to take in the exam in the summer, if this comes up, is that there has been a fall in investment relative to trend, partly linked to a decline in exports to the EU. And that can have long-term consequences. And I think that's reinforced by the next bit of data, or the next chart, which is productivity. So we focused in this session on productivity growth. And this chart shows an index of output per worker in the UK from 2008. What it does show is that really productivity growth is barely increasing at all. In fact, if you take the figure for 2018, the index was basically 100. The end of 2022, it's 102. There's only been a 2% rise in productivity in the UK in the last 4 years. So unless and until the UK lifts its productivity, we're not going to get the gains in competitiveness, whether we're inside the European Union or whether we're outside the EU. It isn't going to happen. There is an emerging consensus, though, that Brexit is damaging to business. A couple of recent news articles that I spotted. John Haskell, who wrote the famous book Capitalism Without Capital, has argued, now he's on the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, he's argued that Brexit has cost the UK nearly £30 billion in business investment. So he reckons there's been a substantial cost. He reckons it's worth about £1,000 per capita income per person in the UK. And a lot of companies are now saying that they're finding it hard to trade post-Brexit because of all the red tape, the non-tariff barriers. In fact, the next slide, or my penultimate slide, gives you some evidence on this. There has been quite a big fall in trade intensity with the EU. Yes, hopefully we're exporting to other countries more, to maybe faster growing Southeast Asian countries and Japan and New Zealand and Australia. Hopefully, yes. But the number of firms exporting to the EU fell from 27,000 in 2020 to 18,000, just a bit above, in 2021. That is a huge fall in the number of firms in the UK, many of whom are small, medium-sized enterprises exporting to the EU, which is a sign perhaps that the non-tariff barriers are having an effect. Now, just to finish off, I just want to make a couple of points. One is inflation is a big factor. So you'll know as you go into the exam that inflation's been 11%, now down to 10.1%. Clearly, if UK inflation stays high relative to Germany or the EU average or the United States, we will lose competitiveness. That's clearly one of the major factors. So don't forget the stuff you did in year 12, first year macro. Inflation is a key competitiveness factor. But, and this is a point I want to emphasize just to finish with, if you get a question on competitiveness is a macro concept, but it has micro foundations, micro building blocks, if you like. It's really key, and this is true, by the way, talk about the UK, talk about Japan, Malaysia, whatever, Rwanda, Ethiopia. It's really important for a nation to build a diversified industrial base with enough scaled businesses that can operate profitably globally. I think a really good example is South Korea. We've mentioned South Korea several times in this session. You'll probably know it has just a cluster of really successful businesses. Obviously, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and many other companies are globally successful businesses. And South Korea is now a high-income country, and it's probably going to overtake Japan in terms of per capita incomes in the next 5 or 10 years. A really good example of a country to study where the micro foundations are pretty strong. The only downside for South Korea probably is it has one of the most aging societies in the world at the moment. Aging population decline is a big threat to their competitiveness going forward. Okay, well done. Some fantastic answers in today's session. Quick reminder, before we leave you that we're heading to our live events. We're getting ready for them. We're preparing our courses next week and the week after. Please do, if you like a day of live revision plus free subscription to our fantastic online course, the Grade Booster online course, please do think about joining us in Bristol and Birmingham and Leeds, in London, Manchester, Portsmouth, all across the country. We'll be there. A day of intense revision, hopefully very useful, very exam focused days. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. If you found the session useful or enjoyable, we'd love you to press like and maybe subscribe so you get notifications of future live streams. We'll be back next week with some more live economics and all the way through the spring, over Easter and beyond as we head towards the exams. Thanks for joining in today. Stay happy, stay healthy, take care. See you soon.